Well, I guess I was wrong about Canshui. Those folks at the Swedish Academy really are a black box. I often wonder if they look at the betting markets and intentionally disqualify anyone on that list. Maybe next year, Canshui. You certainly deserve the prize. But on to our podcast for today. We are back for our third episode in this podcast series on the Shijing, the book of poems, the book of poetry, the book of songs, whatever you want to call it. Today's poem is translated as She Bore the Folk. That's the way Stephen Owen translates it. The Chinese is just Shengmin. A translation that's probably closer to the original would be something like giving birth to the people. She Bore the Folk is a poem that's a bit different from the two poems that I did in the previous podcast on the book of poetry. Those two poems were lyrical poems. They're supposedly folk songs sung by farmers in the fields and collected by the royalty of these different kingdoms in ancient China. Today's poem is different in a couple of ways. First, She Bore the Folk is definitely not a song. It's also different from the other poems in both length and form. She Bore the Folk is a pretty long poem. The translation that I am using is the one from Stephen Owen's Anthology of Chinese Literature, and that's a great anthology for anyone interested in Chinese literature. You really ought to have that. You can also use it to kill a person. It's that thick. So be careful if you're swinging it around in a crowded room. Today's poem, She Bore the Folk, takes up 2 pages in that anthology that Stephen Owens does. It's not really an epic poem. This isn't like the Iliad or the Odyssey, but it's also not a short 3-stanza poem like the 2 poems we did previously. Today's poem is different also in terms of its form. The first 2 poems we looked at were very repetitive. It was almost like we were reading verses in a chorus. Again, those were songs. That's not true for today's poem, She Bore the Folk. There's basically no repetition in today's poem. She Bore the Folk is also different in terms of content. The first 2 poems we looked at in this series, The Big Rat and Those Tender Peaches, even the poem that Rob and I looked at years before when we did the poem from the Shijing called Guan Guan Goes the Osprey, those poems have a lot of repetition in them. That is not true of She Bore the Folk. She Bore the Folk is not about a single object like the Big Rat or Those Tender Peaches or the Osprey. It's actually more of a mythological story. It's the story of the mythical birth of Huoji, the god of agriculture. I've talked a lot. I think it's time that I just read a bit of the translation of the poem so that you get a feel for what we are dealing with. Here we go. She who first bore the folk, Jiang it was, first parent. How was it she bore the folk? She knew the right and sacrifice to rid herself of sunlessness. She trod the god's toe print, and she was glad. She was made great, on her luck settled. The seed stirred, and it was quick. She gave birth, she gave suck, and this was Lord Millet. When her months had come to term, her firstborn sprang up, not splitting, not rending, working no harm, no hurt. He showed his godhead glorious. The high God was greatly soothed. He took great joy in those rites, and easily she bore her son. She set him in a narrow lane, but sheep and cattle warded him. She set him in the wooded plain. He met with those who logged the plain. She set him on cold ice. Birds sheltered him with wings. Then the birds left him, and Lord Millet wailed. This was long and this was loud. His voice was a mighty one. So there's a lot of weird things going on in this poem. This is just the first 2 or 3 stanzas of this 2-page long poem. I'm going to break down the things that I read because it's fairly difficult to figure out what in that poem, what is the plot? It does have a plot, but it's just very hard to figure out unless you know some of the background and you're able to kind of think on what is happening. So first, this is the story about the birth of Huo Ji. His mother, her last name is Jiang. Her first name may be Yuan, or that may actually just be the word for original mother. The character that's used here for Yuan, it's constituted by the components for the character for woman and the character for original. So in the same way that in Hebrew, Adam is maybe the name of the first person to walk the earth in the Bible, or it could just mean man or mankind in general. You see a similar thing going on here with the word Yuan in Chinese. And whether or not you interpret this as Huo Ji's mother's name or as just general first woman, original woman, something like that, changes how you interpret the passage. So what actually happens? She steps into the toe print of a god and she becomes pregnant. It turns out that this mysterious birth, conceived of without sexual intercourse, gives birth to a god, and he is awesome. The birth, the poem says, was very easy. The god who was born, he likes the rites, he likes the rituals, those things that define much of Chinese life in this era and are the focus of what people in Zhou society would talk about when they talk about religion and how to be a good person. Then what happens? Mom abandons her god/son, leaving him in the alleyways amongst the sheep and the cows who help raise him. She leaves him with birds. All these kinds of mythological things are going on here. Those of y'all who have a passing familiarity with Christianity or Judaism or Islam will notice that there are some shared elements in this story. There is a son who is abandoned. There is a miraculous birth conceived of apparently by contact with this physical imprint of a god. Now, none of this is to say that this story has any connection to Christianity or Judaism, though it's being written about the same time that early Judean history is occurring. I think that it's unlikely there's any connection. I don't want to read the rest of the poem. This is not my translation, so I'm not even going to post the poem on the website, but let me just summarize the rest. We see Miss Jiang, original woman Jiang, she gets impregnated after stepping into the footprint of a god. She abandons her son. He's raised in a kind of mythological manner. The poem continues. This god becomes Lord Millet. I should point out here, I keep saying Huo Ji and Lord Millet in different contexts. Those are the same person. Huo Ji is the Chinese name. Lord Millet is Stephen Owen's English translation of Huo Ji. So they're the same person. Sorry, I should have clarified that earlier. So Huo Ji, he teaches the people, that is the Chinese people, how to grow crops. He is the bringer of the grains, such as millet. He not only brings millet to the Chinese people, but he also teaches them how to grow and process the grain. Lord Millet becomes the creator of the agricultural rites that the Zhou dynasty Chinese folks would use, the things which function as the core of Zhou dynasty religion. So that's the basic plot of this poem. Let's talk about what is important in this poem. First, it is the Shi Jing. This is the book of poems. So because of that, this poem is inherently important. That said, it's not the most important poem in the Shi Jing, or at least it's not the most loved poem in the Shi Jing. There are a lot more famous, a lot more quoted poems in this compilation of poetry. Guan Guan Goes the Osprey is definitely the most quoted poem in this collection. The Shi Jing has lyric poems like Those Tender Peaches, but it also contains these poems which are essentially mythological narrative poems. Poems like She Bore the Folk. But it's interesting because when you look at the literary history of these poems, Chinese folks, Chinese writers tended to choose lyrical poems when they decide what they want to read, what they want to quote. If you were to go back and ask any Han Dynasty reader, they would say all of these poems are equally important because they're in the Shi Jing, and this book, this collection of poetry is amazing. That's what a Han Dynasty thinker would say. But when we read what they wrote, it tends to be drawing from the lyrical poetry. So one of the most famous works in Chinese literature, Tang Xianzu's Peony Pavilion, the action for this play is precipitated by a woman reading Guan Guan Goes the Osprey. She reads this poem, she reads it in the wrong way, and that is the inciting event that starts the drama. I can't think of any reference by later Chinese writers to any of these narrative poems in the Shijing, such as She Bore the Folk. I'm sure they are there, but they're very few in number. Second, this poem is mythological, and it speaks to the interesting role of mythology in Chinese life. I have a PhD in Chinese literature, and it's remarkable coming from a Western background, someone who grew up being familiar with Greek and Roman literature. It's remarkable to me that China really doesn't use its mythology. Chinese literature, Chinese society has a mythology. It's kind of squirreled away in bits and pieces of anthologies, collections of texts like the Shijing. You have a Fuxi and a Nuwa, these gods who are the founders of humanity. But you really don't have them playing a big role in Chinese literature, Chinese mythology. Later authors are aware of these myths, but they don't take up a big part of the Chinese discursive universe. When you're reading bunches of different Chinese texts, it's not like going through Greek drama or Roman poetry. People aren't constantly referencing these mythological figures. I recently reread the cycle of poems by Aeschylus that begins with the play Agamemnon. And it's interesting because you have the Greeks who are constantly referencing this mythological past. It's not a real past. And I think that the Greeks, to a certain degree, realized that there was a difference between mythology and history. I'm not an expert on Greece, but my read of Greek culture is that there were two separate registers, mythology and history, and they understood that these two things aren't really the same. In China, there is also mythology and history mixed together. And what's interesting is when the Chinese authors discuss the past, they almost never discuss mythology. It happens, but it's fairly rare. When Chinese writers want to talk about moral lessons, they don't go to their mythological figures. They usually go to historical figures, or at least figures who we know could have maybe existed. Whether or not they were real historical figures or not, that's a different thing. For example, I haven't done a podcast on Bo Yi and Shu Qi. These are two brothers. They witnessed the dynasty of the Shang being overthrown. They were a part of the Shang. And after it was overthrown, the Zhou dynasty is established. But Bo Yi and Shu Qi, these two brothers, refused to eat the food of the new dynasty because they were so loyal to the old dynasty. Did Bo Yi and Shu Qi exist? Who knows? Could they have existed? You betcha. Now, what's interesting is Bo Yi and Shu Qi are constantly being referred to in Chinese literature all over the place. Huo Ji, this Lord Millet guy? Not so much. That gets me into a larger point. In China, there has long been a tendency to avoid discussions of things that clearly aren't real, that are mythological. In China, there is a long tradition of being grounded in empirical realities. And this goes back 2,000-3,000 years. Yes, of course, there is a whole genre of ghost stories in Chinese literature. Lots of people loved them. I love them. But Confucius, what did he say about these ghost stories? He said, I don't concern myself with ghosts. The Confucian tradition that followed him largely marginalized these ghost stories. Interestingly, you don't really have something like quote-unquote fiction developing in China until you can really start to pin it down around 700-800 AD. Much, much later than you have in the European tradition or the Indian tradition. There are so many great mythological literary works coming out of India. Some of those are getting translated into Chinese at this point in this period. But the Chinese themselves aren't really producing quote-unquote fiction until a much later stage in the development of world literature. What does that say? I don't know. You can make a lot of conclusions out of that. Some of them, I think, would probably be harebrained, so I'm not going to try. But I just want to note that this poem is a mythological poem, and it's also an example of how little of a role mythology plays in Chinese literature. Okay, I've gone on long enough. Today's poem was Sheng Ming, She Bore the Folk, or literally giving birth to the people. Today's Chengyu is Sheng Min Tu Tan. So it takes the title of the poem and turns it into a 4-character Chengyu. The Chengyu means something like the people, the average folk, the Lao Bai Xing, they have encountered extreme hardship. All right. If you like what I'm doing, shoot me an email, ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. If you want to show your support, you can find me on Patreon, Chinese Literature Podcast at patreon.com. My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.